The first year of the war had seemed to favor the Confederacy. Victories at Bull Run and Wilson's Creek galvanized Southern morale. Beneath this facade of success, however, mounting problems were becoming apparent. President Lincoln and the North prepared for a long war. By October of 1861, Union forces around Washington alone numbered around 100,000 men. Confederate forces in Virginia did not exceed 50,000. This meant that as time passed, the opportunities for coordinated northern offensives would likely enjoy a numerical superiority in every area. If successful, these strikes would greatly hurt the Confederacy's ability to sustain itself at war and severely deteriorate the strategic situation for the South. In the last episode of our series about the Trans-Mississippi Theater, we saw how Sterling Price continued his campaign in Missouri during the autumn of 1861, the seizure of Lexington being the zenith of his campaign. Almost as soon as victory was his, however, McCulloch's words seemed to ring true. Price was forced to abandon Lexington after holding the town for 1 week, as federal forces under John C. Fremont, numbering over 30,000 men, began pushing the Missouri State Guard. Price withdrew southwest into a swampy area near Ozarks. He did not want to seek McCulloch's help, but without him and his forces, he could not hope to defeat Fremont. McCulloch had stayed in Arkansas with a force of about 6,000 men, where he pushed west and promised his superiors to ravage Kansas. However, on the way, his army suffered heavily from an outbreak of measles. This led Fremont to give up his pursuit of Price and headed back to St. Louis using the railway, from where he headed to Springfield, and from there he could easily march on and capture Fayetteville, which was McCulloch's main supply base. By the 1st of November, McCulloch was back in Arkansas and had established his base across Timber Hollow, some 17 miles south of the Missouri border. The position blocked the main road south, and McCulloch told his men that Fremont would get a warm reception. Fremont, however, stopped his advance and suddenly began going back north. McCulloch went after the federal forces, hustled by their timidity, and by the 18th of November, he occupied Springfield for the second time. The day after arriving there, though, he sent the following message to Richmond. "Sir, I shall return to Arkansas, put my troops in winter quarters soon, and ask permission to come immediately to Richmond, so as to give the administration correct information regarding affairs in this region before it acts on matters here." McCulloch's hasty departure to Richmond was due to a smear campaign against him. Price and Confederate governor of Missouri, Claiborne Jackson, had started the campaign. McCulloch left James McIntosh in command, and he assumed that with winter approaching, nothing would happen in the near future. In Fremont's department, there had been substantial changes. The timidity of the army in the face of McCulloch's much smaller force was due to a change in leadership. George McClellan had been made overall Union commander, and one of his first acts had been to replace Fremont, first with David Hunter and then with Henry Halleck. Halleck was a West Point officer and had experience from the war with Mexico, and was a staunch Unionist. Halleck was a strategist and logistician, and had published a book on modern strategic warfare in 1846 entitled Elements of Military Art and Science. His intellectual nature and pursuits earned him the nickname Old Brains. Halleck decided on 3 strategic goals for the near future. As soon as possible, 2 Union forces would sail down the Mississippi and Tennessee rivers and besiege the Confederate strongholds of Island 10, Fort Henry, and Fort Donelson, while the remaining Union force would drive Sterling Price out of Missouri, eliminate his force, and if possible secure northern Arkansas. The last operation although the smallest, was necessary to secure the western flanks of the other two offensive actions. Securing Missouri for the Union also meant a strategic blow to the Confederacy. Kentucky and Missouri, combined, supplied most of the pork that was consumed in the southern states, and severing that supply would deprive Confederate armies of an important food source, and good bacon. Halleck gave this last task to Brigadier General Samuel Curtis. Curtis was, like Halleck, a West Pointer, and had military experience from the war with Mexico. His role in Mexico had mainly been administrative, and after the war he had worked as an engineer and been a Republican congressional representative. Curtis had no experience commanding such a large force, and especially Brigadier General Franz Sigel was furious. He had been under the impression that the command was going to be his. When Curtis arrived in Rolla with orders to take command, Sigel began a quarreling and eventually resigned in protest. As about half the Union force was made up of German immigrants, they were deeply sympathetic to him. After a while, President Lincoln himself had to get involved, and Sigel agreed to recall his resignation. In return, he was put in charge of 2 divisions in the Army and appointed as Curtis' second-in-command. Although this repaired the command of the Union Army, the 2 commanders were deeply distrustful of each other, and Curtis kept Sigel on a short leash. Price had moved away from Osceola and relocated to Springfield, where he decided to settle into winter quarters, arriving on the 22nd of December. Curtis assumed that Price was retreating to Arkansas and sent Colonel Eugene Carr to harass him with a detachment of cavalry. Carr quickly reported to Curtis that Price was not going anywhere. And when Curtis forwarded this information to Halleck on January 13th, Curtis was told to move against Price. Curtis moved towards Springfield from Rolla along the Telegraph Road. In dry summer weather, the road would have been adequate, but during winter, through freezing rain, it became a muddy hell. When the army arrived in Lebanon, one Union soldier commented that it had been mud without mercy. Curtis's army was now within striking distance of Price. What Curtis feared most at this point was having to pursue Price. He knew that for every step he took, he would be further away from the railhead at Rolla. Supplies would have to be transported by wagons the rest of the way, creating a long and vulnerable supply line. The undeveloped nature of Arkansas would also be a factor, as well as the rough terrain in the Ozarks Mountains. Curtis needed the right man for the job, and Halleck supplied him with Captain Philip Sheridan, who would serve as quartermaster of the army. Sheridan had graduated from West Point in 1853, and he would go on to serve as general of the Union Army. Curtis's army of some 12,000 men and 50 artillery pieces was put into its final organization when it arrived at Lebanon. His force was split into 4 divisions. First Division was led by Peter J. Osterhaus. Osterhaus was a Prussian who had studied at the Berlin Military Academy. He had taken part in the German Revolution of 1848. Osterhaus had fought in the Battle of Wilson's Creek and had done well. His men had held the line on Bloody Hill, despite repeated Southern attacks. The Second Division was led by Alexander Aspath. He was a Hungarian who had been educated as an engineer. After serving in the Hungarian Revolution and attaining the rank of lieutenant colonel, he fled to America. These 2 divisions were under the leadership of Franz Sigel, who was also a German ex-revolutionary. The Third Division was led by Jefferson C. Davis. Davis had the misfortune of having a similar name to the Confederate president, Jefferson F. Davis. There was, however, no relation between the 2. He did not have formal military training and started the Mexican War as a private. After years of excellent service, he had worked his way up to the rank of lieutenant. Promotions followed rapidly at the start of the Civil War, and he went from regiment to brigade to division. The 4th Division was led by Eugene Carr. He was a West Point graduate and had combat experience from fighting Apaches. At the start of the Civil War, he received rapid promotions. All of these men were competent officers in their own right and could be relied on to handle their divisions effectively. Curtis was determined to move against Price as soon as possible, and a shocking intelligence report submitted to Curtis by Captain Steele further assured the Union general. 2 of my spies just in from Springfield humbucked Price completely. Went through all his camps safely. Saw everything. At present, he has no discipline, no roll calls, no sentinels, nor pickets to prevent passing in and out of Springfield. Rains drunk all the time. Price also drinking too much. Price was watching the assembling Union army with dismay. Although it was the dead of winter, it was obvious that Curtis was planning to strike. Price had about 7,000 effective men at this point, which was too little to fight the organized Federal army. He did not want to retreat during winter, as it would likely further diminish his forces. Price swallowed his pride and began sending repeated messages to McCulloch and asked him for help. McCulloch was, however, in Richmond because of Price's own efforts to smear him, so the messages went to newly promoted Brigadier General James McIntosh. He had no intention of marching to Price's relief given the current season. Once this became clear to Price, he knew that he had to retreat, but he had almost left it too late. On February 10th, Curtis set off from Lebanon with his entire force. The weather had improved, so marching conditions were better. By February 12th, Curtis was a mere 8 miles from Springfield. Price sent out cavalry to delay the Union advance, and the two sides skirmished. Price then slipped out of Springfield during the night with his forces and headed towards Arkansas. Price's cavalry achieved their intended effect, and Curtis became more careful, only advancing slowly the next day. As the Union soldiers moved forward, they met no resistance, and before noon, the Stars and Stripes flew above the Springfield courthouse. The Union army rested for a day and feasted on the supplies that Price's forces had left. Curtis had already decided to pursue Price, even at the risk of bringing McCulloch north. Sigel was quick to offer a plan that would end Price's forces once and for all. Sigel would take his 2 divisions along a smaller road, force march them, and get in front of Price, while Curtis would pursue along the main road with the other 2 divisions. This plan was almost identical to the plan that Sigel had offered before Wilson's Creek, which had led to so much misfortune for the Union army. Halleck, in fact, advised Curtis not to let Sigel talk him into dividing his forces, but by then Curtis had already agreed and the plan went ahead. Price took his time during the retreat. He had not yet decided whether he was going all the way to Arkansas. He stopped his men and set up camp around Crane Creek Valley. Price was unsure whether Curtis was going to keep up the pursuit. Union cavalry, under Colonel Ellis, went up a hill and suddenly found themselves looking out across the Missouri State Guard camps. Ellis could not resist the temptation and ordered his 4 small howitzers to open fire. He captured some 30 enemy soldiers and then fell back, not knowing that he had sabotaged Curtis's plan. Price was scared into action. He put his supply wagons in front and appointed Henry Little's brigade to serve as rear guard. His force began racing away from Curtis, and the distance between the forces now widened. Price's increased speed meant that Sigel had not managed to get in front and block his retreat. And not only that, Sigel moved so slowly along the small road that Curtis was even ahead of him with the rest of the army when Sigel rejoined the main road at McDowell. Price's force made it to Arkansas. He left Henry Little's brigade to again act as a rear guard, and his brigade skirmished with the Federal cavalry. As soon as a fight began to develop, the Missouri State Guard would withdraw. This game of cat and mouse upset the Union commander, Colonel Ellis. He began setting after them with less and less caution. Price had now made contact with parts of McCulloch's forces. Louis Hebert's brigade of Arkansas and Louisiana troops took over the rear guard from Little's exhausted men. He skirmished for a few days with the pursuing Federals. On February 17th, he set up his men around a farm belonging to James Dunnigan. Hebert simply planned to delay the Federals again, and he set up his brigade in a position that blocked Telegraph Road, and here they did not have to wait long. Ellis was in hot pursuit, and his command galloped down the road, oblivious to the danger in front. His forward momentum was stopped when Confederate artillery opened up straight down the road and emptied a few saddles. Hebert's men fired a volley and killed or wounded about 20 Union soldiers and about 60 horses. Louis Hebert noticed that they were acting far more aggressively than previously, and asked Henry Little to come back and join him in the action. The fight between the two sides developed as more Union soldiers and cannons arrived. Hebert and Little decided to withdraw. They did not want to bring on a general engagement. Both sides claimed victory, having lost about 20 men killed or wounded. Regardless, Price's forces was more or less safe, while Curtis had established himself within Arkansas. In this hive of activity, McCulloch returned from Richmond, and he met with Price on the 17th. The two discussed what action could and should be taken. Price wanted to hold their ground at Cross Hollow and fight there. McCulloch wanted them to take their forces further south to Strickler's Station, where there were large established camps. The argument was settled the next day when scouts informed McCulloch that Union cavalry had begun to spread out in an aggressive fashion and had occupied Bentonville. This persuaded Price of the danger, and the two generals agreed to go further south. On the way, they passed the large Confederate depots at Fayetteville. Unable to take everything with them, McCulloch opened the depots to his soldiers and allowed them to take whatever they wanted. This soon turned to outright looting, and many civilians lost their property. What could not be moved with them was burned. As the Southerners pulled back, civilians were left to fight the fires, largely unsuccessfully. On the 21st of February, the Confederate Missouri State Guard soldiers finally reached their destination at Strickler's Station. For the men of Missouri State Guard, especially, who had marched over 100 miles in less than 10 days, it was most welcome. The cavalry that had scared both McCulloch and Price turned out to be just an exploration of the surrounding area by Aspath. He had found Bentonville unoccupied and entered the town, captured some 30 prisoners, and was back at Curtis's main position at Little Sugar Creek by sundown. When news reached Curtis of the Confederate retreat from Fayetteville, he ordered Aspath to occupy the area. The Unionists of the town greeted his men, and some civilians produced a long-hidden Union flag and hung it from the courthouse. Those who favored the Union hoped that the city was finally free from Confederate occupation. Aspath wanted to stay, but in the end he was ordered back to Little Sugar Creek. Curtis knew that the combined forces of McCulloch and Price now outnumbered him, and he would allow them to make the first move while he entrenched at Little Sugar Creek. Curtis also knew that there was a new opponent in the area. Confederate President Jefferson Davis knew that he would have to intervene in the military affairs of the Trans-Mississippi. The current situation with two small separate armies headed by two commanders who hated each other and had a hard time cooperating did not work. Davis had thus appointed Earl Van Dorn to serve as head of both armies. Van Dorn had secured his place at West Point largely due to his family's connections, as his great-uncle was none other than former President of the United States Andrew Jackson. At West Point, he was not a great student, but he passed and served afterwards both in the war against Mexico and had been fighting various natives. He had been known in the U.S. Army as one of the best Indian fighters, and this type of fast-moving warfare appealed to him. He had a reputation for bravery, and during a clash with the natives at Wichita Village, he had been wounded by 2 arrows that he supposedly extracted himself. Van Dorn had shown zeal during the Civil War. In the immediate aftermath of Fort Sumter, he had captured many Union soldiers in Texas. Despite his previous exploits, he had not been the first man Davis wanted for the job. The Confederate president had originally asked Braxton Bragg, but he declined the offer. Davis had then offered the command to Henry Heath, but he preferred his brigade command in the east and declined as well. The job was then finally offered to Earl Van Dorn, who happily accepted. Upon taking command, Van Dorn had planned for an offensive from Pocahontas, Arkansas, to capture St. Louis, but the moving situation forced him to reconsider. He rode across the state of Arkansas with 2 raids during the latter part of February, and at one point fell into a river. This led to a severe cold that meant that for large parts of the following campaign he was riding in an ambulance wagon. Van Dorn reorganized his forces quickly upon arrival, and out of the 2 separate armies he created a unified Army of the West. even adopting a new flag for his army. His force consisted of 2 divisions, one led by McCulloch, and the other under the command of Price. McCulloch's division had 2 large brigades under Louis Hebert and James McIntosh. McCulloch's division had 18 guns in 4 batteries and 2 unbrigaded infantry regiments. When the campaign started, a brigade consisting of Native Americans under the leadership of Albert Pike also joined McCulloch's division. Pike had military experience from Mexico, and he had been selected by the Confederate government to drum up Native support. In this endeavor, he had been highly successful. All in all, the division likely had around 9,000 men. Price's division was made up of the previous Missouri State Guard forces, and only 2 brigades had been organized fully, one led by Lewis H. Little, the other by William Y. Slack. A 3rd brigade under Colton Green was partially organized. The rest of the force was still in the Missouri State Guard divisional setup. Price had a total of 42 guns organized into 10 artillery batteries, and his division was likely around 7,000 men strong. Van Dorn began to alter his original plans. He wanted to destroy Curtis's army, then march on St. Louis, use the weapons at the arsenal to equip even more men, and then join Albert Sidney Johnston in Tennessee. In a letter to his wife, he wrote that, "I must have St. Louis or huzzah." Texas cavalry began to ride north. It started to scout while also raiding the long, exposed Federal supply line. When the scouts returned, they had done their job well, and they had a clear idea of the Federal deployment. On March 3rd, McCulloch was able to tell Van Dorn that Curtis's force was split into 2. Sigel's 2 divisions were at Bentonville, while the main force was entrenching along Little Sugar Creek. Van Dorn decided that he would issue a forced march, destroy Sigel's force, and then march on Curtis. If successful, he would outnumber both forces about 3 to 1. The plan looked promising on paper. Van Dorn ordered his men to travel light. They were supposed to carry only 3 days' worth of rations and ammunition. All other necessities like tents were left behind. Extra supplies for the men would be brought by a wagon train, but it was supposed to stay behind so the march could be executed swiftly. The plan was deeply affected by Van Dorn's background as a cavalry officer and Indian fighter. He left very little attention to planning contingencies or logistics. His men would have to march 38 miles north through rough terrain without being detected by Federals. The move north began on March 4th, but from the start there were worrying signs. The weather had turned again, and a late winter snowstorm tortured the Southerners as they moved hastily northwards. Unknown to Van Dorn, his plan was already in trouble. Curtis was worried about Sigel's exposed position, and on March 3rd he ordered him to bring his forces to Little Sugar Creek. Sigel was, however, of the opinion that the Southerners were not on the verge of doing anything, and he therefore took his time, which left Van Dorn a small window of opportunity. Van Dorn ordered McIntosh's cavalry to demonstrate towards Curtis and then move west and hit Sigel. On March 5th, the Confederates moved steadily north. The weather improved slightly, and Sigel played right into their hands. He withdrew his outposts and pickets, presumably in preparation to join Curtis. One of Sigel's cavalry officers refused the order, left his Missouri cavalry to the south of Bentonville at a place called Elm Springs. On the 5th of March, they encountered the advancing 3rd Texas Cavalry of Colonel Greer. The 2 sides skirmished until nightfall. The Southerners had been discovered. Curtis had actually discovered the Southerners' move earlier. Spies within the Confederate force had alerted him to the move, and he sent 2 urgent messages to Sigel to move immediately, even if that meant marching his men by night. It was, however, the action of his own cavalry that finally persuaded Sigel of the threat, and after an emergency meeting held at 1 a.m. in the night, on the 6th of February, he ordered Aspath and the wagons to march immediately. Osterhaus would follow afterwards. The retreat from Bentonville went well for the Federals. Aspath moved quickly, and Osterhaus followed suit. Sigel kept 600 men at Bentonville as a rear guard, and he planned to add the cavalry from Elm Springs to his force as well, and a battery of artillery, giving Sigel a rear guard of about 1,200 men. On the morning of the 6th, Sigel went to the local hotel to eat breakfast. but he had failed to pass on his orders to his cavalry, so they simply left town, reducing his rear guard to 600 men. At 10 a.m., Sigel's breakfast was interrupted by retreating Union cavalry, who told him that the Confederates were right behind him. Sigel then discovered that half his intended rear guard had already marched off. The 600 men were now left to tangle with the entire Confederate cavalry, likely some 3,000 men. Sigel's force began leaving Bentonville half an hour later, and then the Confederate cavalry rode into town. At this point, McIntosh decided against simply pursuing Sigel and hitting him. Instead, he divided his force. Half the force on the rear would pursue and harass Sigel, while he would take the other half and circle around the Union force and cut their retreat. The plan was good, but it quickly fell apart. McIntosh was slowed by rough terrain and the cold weather. Sigel's force was able to stay ahead of them and reached a critical crossing point just before McIntosh arrived. The two sides skirmished until 3:30 p.m., but McIntosh was unable to prevent the Federal retreat, and his further attempts to outflank them failed. By 8 p.m., Curtis had assembled his entire force at Little Sugar Creek. His position was excellent, and Van Dorn had failed in his bid to destroy Sigel. The Confederates stopped their pursuit 3 miles from the Union position at a place called Camp Stevens. Van Dorn's army was still stretched out on the roads, and men continued to arrive gradually. Van Dorn was not going to give up that easily, and on the evening of the 6th of February, as his exhausted army was still marching through the area where he met with McCulloch and Price. McCulloch knew the area well. His men had marched and camped everywhere during the last year, and he informed Van Dorn that Curtis's position along Little Sugar Creek was well chosen. The position was on top of a high ridge, with the creek running in front and acting like a medieval moat. Van Dorn quickly realized that a frontal assault was out of the question. McCulloch told Van Dorn that there was a road going past Curtis's right flank, which the locals called the Bentonville Detour, and he suggested that if they used that road, they could get behind a strong Federal position. For once, and to everyone's shock, Price agreed with McCulloch's idea. Both the divisional commanders had thought that they could use the road during the next days, and after the army was concentrated, but Van Dorn had other ideas. He ordered that the exhausted Confederate army was to start marching around Curtis's flank that very night. McCulloch was shocked. He argued that the army was exhausted and should rest, at least for the night, before they moved on. Van Dorn would have none of it. He was afraid the Federals would retreat and get away from him. Major Ross of the 6th Texas Cavalry would later write that the truth of the whole matter was, General Van Dorn did not believe the Federals would fight him, but rather that they would get away from him. The Confederates began marching on the Bentonville Detour that same evening. The goal was for both divisions to reach Cross Timber Hollow and around Elkhorn Tavern before sunrise. They had built several fires to lure the Federals into thinking that they were still encamped, when they were in fact moving around the Union army. Van Dorn intended the march to be swift, but there were problems early on. McIntosh cavalry were meant to be in front as a vanguard, but Price's division had already started to march. They were in front and were holding up the cavalry. The march was much slower than intended, and problems gradually kept piling up for the Confederate forces. Price's advanced Missouri cavalry encountered Union pickets, and their advance was slowed by fallen trees across the roads around 12 Corner Church. When the sun rose, it was clear that they were behind schedule, and Van Dorn's entire force was stretched out on the Bentonville Detour. The front of Price's division was in the area of Cross Timber Hollow when the sun rose, while McCulloch's division was still around the church. Van Dorn made the fatal decision at this point to split his forces. He told McCulloch to take Ford Road and march towards Elkhorn Tavern, where he would meet Price's division. The Texan complied and put his division on the road. In the Union camp, General Curtis had been informed by scouts that something was happening around his right flank. There were Confederates in the area around 12 Corner Church. Curtis called a council of war with his division commanders and asked for their opinion. Van Dorn had stolen a march on the Union army, and the Confederates had turned his right flank. The choice was simple: stand and fight, or retreat. Franz Sigel favored retreating. He was convinced that if they stayed, they would be crushed. In order to fight Van Dorn, they would have to wheel the army to secure his right flank. The division commanders disagreed with Sigel. Carr and Davis thought they could fight it out, as did Osterhaus. Curtis decided to stay and fight, and in the early morning of the 7th, he began moving troops towards Lee Town. As the darkness began to lift in the early morning hours on the 6th of March, 1862, the two armies were beginning their final movements onto what would soon cause a great contest of arms. In fact, they were all headed for the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought in the state of Arkansas. This has been our third video in our series about the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the American Civil War. Make sure to subscribe to catch the next video, Bloody Battle of Pea Ridge. See you next time.